Have you noticed something lately? The retirement numbers people talk about today don't seem to mean what they used to. For years, maybe even decades, Americans have been told that if they could somehow accumulate $1 million or maybe $1.5 million, they would be set for life. That number became the dream. It became the finish line. It became the target hanging on the wall that people chased throughout their entire careers. And honestly, I understand why. If somebody had told you back in the 1990s that you would retire with $1.50 million sitting in your accounts, you would have felt like you won the lottery. That was serious money. That was the kind of money that could make people stop worrying about retirement altogether. But here's the reality that very few people want to talk about. The world has changed. The math has changed. And unfortunately, many retirement plans haven't changed with it. Today, I want to walk you through why $1.50 million is no longer the comfortable retirement number it once was. Now, before anybody gets upset, let me be very clear. I'm not saying that $1.50 million isn't a tremendous accomplishment. It absolutely is. Most Americans will never come close to accumulating that amount of money. If you build a portfolio that size, you deserve to be proud of what you've accomplished. But pride and reality are two different things. The reality is that retirement costs in 2026 look dramatically different than retirement costs looked 20 or 30 years ago. And if you're still basing your retirement goals on outdated assumptions, you could be setting yourself up for a very unpleasant surprise later in life. The purpose of this conversation isn't to scare you. It's not to make you panic. It's not to make you feel like you've failed. It's simply to help you see retirement through today's lens instead of yesterday's. Because when you understand the new reality, you can make better decisions, and better decisions create better outcomes. Now let's start with the obvious question. Why did $1.50 million become the magic number in the first place? Well, back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, $1 million and certainly $1.5 million represented extraordinary wealth for most retirees. Life expectancy was shorter. Healthcare expenses were significantly lower. Inflation had remained relatively tame for years. Housing costs were more manageable. Insurance costs were lower. And retirement planning assumptions were based on much shorter retirement periods. Back then, many financial planners assumed retirees would spend around 20 years in retirement. Retire at 65, live until 85. Simple. Using the famous 4% withdrawal rule, a $1.50 million portfolio could generate roughly $60,000 annually before Social Security benefits even entered the picture. Add Social Security to that income stream and many retirees could enjoy a very comfortable lifestyle. Vacations, dining out, helping grandchildren, maintaining their home, living without constantly checking their bank balance. That was the promise, and for many people during that era, it was a realistic promise. The problem is that numbers tend to stick in our minds. Once society decides that a certain number equals success, that number gets passed down from generation to generation. Parents tell their children, financial magazines repeat it, television personalities mention it, friends talk about it. Eventually it becomes accepted wisdom. Nobody stops to ask whether the assumptions behind the number still make sense. And that's exactly what's happened with retirement planning. People are still chasing yesterday's number while living in today's economy. And that's a dangerous mismatch. Let me give you an example. Imagine someone told you 20 years ago that a gallon of milk would always cost $2. You'd probably laugh if someone believed that today. Why? Because prices change. The purchasing power of money changes. The economy changes. Yet somehow when it comes to retirement planning, many people still cling to numbers established decades ago. And that brings us to one of the biggest forces changing retirement today, inflation. Now, inflation isn't exciting. It doesn't make headlines every day. It isn't flashy. But inflation is one of the most powerful wealth destroyers in existence. It's silent, it's gradual, and that's exactly why it's so dangerous. Over the last several years, Americans have experienced some of the highest inflation rates seen in decades. Groceries cost more, gas costs more, insurance costs more, property taxes cost more. Utilities cost more, medical expenses cost more, everything costs more. And the scary part is that these increases don't disappear. Once prices move higher, they usually stay higher. Think about your own life. How much more are you paying today for everyday necessities compared to just a few years ago? Most people can feel it. You don't need an economist to tell you. You see it every time you go shopping. You see it every time you open a bill. You see it every time you review your monthly expenses. The lifestyle that required $80,000 per year just a few years ago may now require $95,000 or even $100,000 annually. That's not because people became extravagant. It's because inflation quietly moved the goalposts. And retirees often feel this more intensely than working-age households. Why? Because retirees don't typically receive large salary increases. Many are living on fixed income sources. Some income streams adjust for inflation. Many don't fully keep pace. But expenses don't care. They rise regardless. I've seen this firsthand. For years, retirees would tell themselves they didn't need to spend more money. They'd maintain the same budget. They'd resist increasing their lifestyle expenses. Then inflation hit, and suddenly they weren't choosing to spend more. They had no choice. Everything around them became more expensive. The same lifestyle simply required more dollars. That's why a retirement portfolio that felt comfortable in 2020 may feel much tighter in 2026. The portfolio didn't necessarily shrink, the purchasing power shrank. And that's a critical distinction. $1.5 million sounds impressive, but retirement isn't funded with impressive numbers. Retirement is funded with purchasing power. That's what really matters. Can your money buy what you need it to buy? Can it support the lifestyle you want? Can it withstand rising costs year after year? Those are the questions that matter. And inflation has changed the answers. But inflation isn't the only factor creating pressure. The second major factor is actually good news. People are living longer. Now, at first glance, that sounds wonderful. And it is. Longer life is a blessing. More birthdays, more family memories, more time with grandchildren, more opportunities to enjoy life. But longer life also creates a financial challenge, because every extra year you live requires additional income. Every extra year means more food, more healthcare, more housing expenses, more insurance, more everything. And that's where retirement planning gets complicated. A retirement plan that works perfectly for 20 years may struggle badly over 30 years. The longer your retirement lasts, the harder your money has to work. Today, many healthy retirees can reasonably expect to spend 30 years in retirement. And for married couples, there's a very real possibility that one spouse could live into their 90s. That's not unusual anymore. That's increasingly common. So when people tell me, I don't think I'll live that long, I understand the sentiment. But retirement planning isn't about betting on dying early. It's about preparing for living longer. Because running out of money at 90 is a far bigger problem than leaving some money behind. That's why longevity has fundamentally changed retirement math. The old assumptions simply don't hold up the way they once did. And unfortunately, we're just getting started. Because the next challenge may be the most expensive of all. Healthcare. Let's talk about healthcare for a moment, because this is where many retirement plans that look great on paper begin to fall apart in real life. When most people imagine retirement, they picture freedom, they picture travel, they picture golf courses, fishing trips, family gatherings, road trips, and long mornings without alarm clocks. Very few people sit down and imagine prescription costs, hospital visits, specialists, physical therapy, long-term care facilities. But whether we think about those expenses or not, they eventually become part of the retirement journey for many Americans. And the truth is simple. Healthcare has become one of the largest financial expenses retirees face. For years, medical costs have increased faster than general inflation. That means healthcare isn't just getting more expensive, it's getting expensive faster than almost everything else. Think about that for a second. If your retirement plan only keeps pace with normal inflation, but healthcare grows even faster, then a larger and larger portion of your retirement income gets consumed by medical expenses over time. That's not speculation, that's reality. Now let's put some numbers behind this. Many recent estimates suggest that a typical couple retiring at age 65 could spend well over $300,000 on healthcare throughout retirement. And that's before we even start talking about long-term care. Let me repeat that, $300,000. And that's not for luxury healthcare, that's not for extraordinary circumstances. That's simply what many average retirees may face over the course of a long retirement. Now imagine you're sitting there with a $1.50 million portfolio. At first glance, it sounds like you have plenty. But if several $100,000 of that portfolio is effectively reserved for healthcare costs, your lifestyle portfolio suddenly becomes much smaller. Instead of looking at $1.50 million available to fund your dreams, vacations, hobbies, and daily living expenses, you may realistically be looking at something closer to $1.20 million. And that changes everything, because now we're talking about a much smaller income stream supporting your lifestyle. That's where many retirees get caught off guard. They see the total portfolio balance, But they don't separate the money mentally into categories. They don't account for future healthcare obligations. They don't reserve funds for unexpected medical events. And then one day reality arrives, a surgery, a diagnosis, an assisted living need, a long-term care situation. And suddenly the financial plan experiences stress. Not because the person was irresponsible, not because they made bad choices, but because they planned around the headline number rather than the usable number. I've always believed that peace of mind comes from preparation. When people know their healthcare costs have been accounted for, they tend to enjoy retirement more. Why? Because they stop worrying. They know they've already built a cushion. They know they've planned ahead. They know they aren't gambling with their future. That confidence is worth a lot. But healthcare isn't the only hidden drain on retirement income. Let's talk about another one that catches people by surprise: taxes. Now, this is where retirement gets interesting, because many people spend decades assuming they'll pay less in taxes once they stop working. Sometimes that's true, but not always. And in many cases, retirees discover their tax situation is much more complicated than they expected. Here's why. Most people save heavily inside tax-deferred retirement accounts, traditional 401ks, traditional IRAs, other pre-tax retirement vehicles. The money grows for years, sometimes decades, and that's great. The problem comes later. Eventually, the government wants its share. Every dollar that comes out of those accounts can create taxable income. Then Social Security enters the picture. Maybe a pension enters the picture. Perhaps investment income enters the picture. Before long, multiple income sources begin stacking on top of each other, and suddenly retirees find themselves paying more taxes than they expected, sometimes much more. Now add state taxes, add Medicare surcharges, add taxes on Social Security benefits, add required minimum distributions. The situation becomes even more complicated. Many retirees assume they have a certain amount of income available to spend, but after taxes, the actual number can look very different. That's why tax planning has become one of the most important parts of retirement planning. It's not just about how much money you've accumulated, it's about how efficiently you can use it. I've seen situations where two families have nearly identical portfolio values. One family keeps significantly more money because they planned carefully. The other family pays substantially more taxes simply because they never created a withdrawal strategy. Same assets, different outcomes. That's powerful. And that's why retirement planning today requires more than just hitting a savings target. You need a strategy, a real strategy, one that considers taxes, healthcare, inflation, market volatility, and longevity all working together. Because retirement isn't a math problem anymore, it's a management problem. And the people who manage it well tend to experience much better outcomes. One strategy that often enters this conversation is Roth conversions. Now, let me be clear. Not everyone should automatically do Roth conversions. That's a mistake people make. Financial planning isn't one size fits all. Every situation is different. Every family is different. Every retirement plan is different. But for many retirees, there can be a valuable opportunity during the years between retirement and Social Security. Those lower income years can sometimes create opportunities to move money from tax-deferred accounts into Roth accounts at favorable tax rates. Why does that matter? Because Roth money grows tax-free. Withdrawals are generally tax-free, and future required distributions can often be reduced. That flexibility can be incredibly valuable later in retirement. Again, it's not about chasing a magic strategy. It's about building a thoughtful plan. The people who thrive in retirement aren't necessarily the people with the biggest portfolios. They're often the people who understand how to use their portfolios efficiently. That's an important distinction, because many Americans hear conversations like this and immediately think they need another $1 million. That's not necessarily true. What they often need is a better plan, a clearer plan, a more realistic plan, a plan built around today's realities instead of yesterday's assumptions. And when you put all these pieces together, inflation, healthcare, taxes and longevity, you begin to understand why $1.50 million doesn't provide the same level of comfort it once did. Let's look at the bigger picture. Imagine retiring in 2026 with exactly $1.50 million. You feel accomplished, and you should. You've worked hard. You've sacrificed, you've saved consistently, you've done many things right, but now reality starts knocking on the door. You need healthcare reserves, you need a tax strategy, you need inflation protection, you need a plan that can survive 30 years, you need flexibility for unexpected events, and suddenly that $1.50 million isn't looking like endless wealth. It's looking more like a solid foundation, a starting point, a base camp. That's why I call it the new floor rather than the old finish line. Because for many households, crossing the $1.50 million mark simply gets you into the game. It doesn't automatically guarantee a luxurious retirement. Now, before somebody misunderstands me, let me say this clearly. Money alone does not determine retirement happiness. I've met retirees with modest portfolios who are incredibly happy. I've met wealthy retirees who are miserable. Retirement satisfaction comes from much more than account balances. It comes from relationships, purpose, health, faith, family, community, gratitude. Those things matter enormously. In fact, some of the happiest retirees I've ever met were people who learned how to enjoy life without constantly comparing themselves to others. They understood that contentment isn't purchased, it's cultivated, and that's a lesson worth remembering. But financial security still matters, because while money doesn't buy happiness, it can buy options, and options create freedom. Freedom to help family, freedom to travel, freedom to handle emergencies, freedom to sleep better at night. Freedom to enjoy retirement without constant financial anxiety. That's why planning matters, not because you're chasing some arbitrary number, but because you're building confidence in your future. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is preparation. The goal isn't predicting every possible outcome. The goal is creating flexibility. The goal isn't having the largest portfolio in town. The goal is having a portfolio that supports the life you want to live. And that's where so many people get stuck. They spend years obsessing over the number, 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million, 3 million, but they never stop to ask a more important question. What kind of life am I actually trying to fund? Because once you answer that question, retirement planning becomes much clearer. The strongest retirement plans I've seen all start with the same foundation. They begin with realistic spending estimates, not guesses, not wishful thinking, real numbers. They separate essential expenses from discretionary expenses. They account for inflation. They account for healthcare. They account for taxes. They build flexibility into the plan. They prepare for market downturns. And perhaps most importantly, they understand that retirement planning is not a one-time event. It's an ongoing process. Because life changes, markets change, laws change, expenses change, and your plan needs the ability to adapt. That's what creates long-term confidence, not a magic number. Not a lucky investment, not a perfect prediction, a thoughtful plan, a realistic plan, a flexible plan. And if there's one thing I hope you take away from today's conversation, it's this: don't let outdated retirement benchmarks determine your future. Don't assume that a number that worked 20 years ago automatically works today. And don't assume that reaching a specific dollar amount means your planning is finished. Retirement is bigger than a number. It's about creating a life that feels secure, meaningful, and sustainable. When you focus on that goal, you stop chasing arbitrary milestones and start building genuine financial freedom. Because at the end of the day, retirement isn't about how much money you have. It's about how confidently you can live the life you've worked so hard to create.